Francois Truffaut, in conversation with Richard Rood in 1977, asserted that auteur theory stemmed from a phrase once used by the writer Jean Giraudoux: "There are no plays, only authors." Hi, I'm Hamish Black and this is Writing on Games. To those that don't know, auteur theory, in the way that Truffaut first imagined it, is the idea that no work of art is greater than the person creating it. The one person's vision, their worldview, their sense of self is so heavily invested into what they create that it inherently shapes the artistic creation and the experience of the person consuming it. There are several notable examples of this in the world of film, given that Truffaut coined the phrase as a director and critic of film and other art forms, but what of video games? With the medium still so relatively young, it is perhaps still fairly difficult to analyse and identify the works of individual game developers and creators in these terms. Given that games take so long to make in comparison to other media, the fact that they usually require very large teams of different kinds of artists, and the fact that auteurism is easier to gauge across an artist's oeuvre as opposed to a singular piece of work. In the 30 or so years that gaming has been in the mainstream consciousness, there have been few developers that have made this kind of individual mark on the games they create. There are certainly still examples of this kind of individual artistic identity shining through in video games though, perhaps most notably the example of Hideo Kojima. The Metal Gear series, since its inception, has been touted proudly as something that Hideo Kojima is at the very centre of. He is credited as director, producer, writer and game designer for all of the main Metal Gear Solid games. As such, every game, for better or worse, invariably carries the unique stamp of Hideo Kojima's mindset. He describes Metal Gear Solid as a child, and that every time he makes a new game, he puts all of his effort completely into that game. The Metal Gear Solid series in particular is hardly known to be a source of great narrative delivery in games. Kojima's dialogue often feels like it is in desperate need of an editor, with frequent unintentional tautologies and long strings of nigh incoherent musings on the nature of war and technology, often wresting control from the player for vast stretches of time. In later games, sometimes for over an hour. When the first Metal Gear Solid came out, it was a revelation that games could actually deliver Hollywood-esque narratives. With all of that said, why is Metal Gear Solid still so highly regarded as a series? One might argue that it is precisely because of Hideo Kojima's hand in the game's development. There really is nothing quite like Metal Gear Solid being made nowadays. The melodrama, the off-the-wall, surreal and often fourth-wall smashing humour, and the way in which this is mixed with dark subject matter in the form of nuclear war, child soldiers, etc., all of this is what keeps people coming back. Kojima's roles as writer, director, designer and producer of these games make these aspects of the series tangibly his. Think about it. This is a series where at one point you fight the former president of the United States as he rides in a Harrier jet piloted by a bisexual vampire. The fact that this sequence is part of one of the most successful video games ever to be released says a lot about people's feelings towards Hideo Kojima's handle on the series. Here we have an artist that is not afraid to meddle with people's expectations regardless of whether or not his decisions are successful. It is with this in mind that it is interesting to consider the potential failings of an auteur. When Truffaut spoke of auteur theory, he spoke of the idea that even the failures of a true auteur were more interesting than the successes of someone who produced films anonymously, as even with the failures of the auteur, there was a sense that it was all building this kind of tapestry, that there was a reason behind someone's failure, and that story of the struggle that went into the production of a film was inherently interesting, regardless of whether or not the film itself was actually worthwhile. In his words, there are no good and bad movies, only good and bad directors. It is therefore interesting to consider that Hideo Kojima has at many points stumbled in his creative endeavours, and admits that even he himself has mixed feelings towards every game he has produced. For example, his most recent release, Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes, was extremely divisive. The main concern many people had was with the length of the game, taking most people around about an hour to complete, yet with some playthroughs taking as little as 5 minutes. But many people take issue with the game's tone to this day. In previous installments, the dark narrative beats regarding war, child soldiers and the like was always counteracted by, for example, Johnny Sasaki shiting himself. Either that or the fact that it was being delivered in such a ham-fisted, obtuse way by gravel-voiced David Hayter created a melodramatic dissonance that made the heaviness of the narrative significantly easier to swallow, or alienated the player enough that they were more concerned with figuring out what the fuck was going on rather than focusing on all the talk of love on the battlefield and stuff. That said, the choice to bring Kiefer Sutherland in as Hayter's replacement, and the higher costs that presumably came with that, render Snake's character essentially a silent protagonist in this installment. This installment, as a result, feels substantially less weird or out there than previous games in the series. Something which, if the realistic nature of the narrative was handled better, would be palatable. Instead, the player is greeted with children having bolts put through their ankles, audio tapes of rape, and graphic, almost fetishistic depictions of stitches being pulled out, and a medic rummaging through a woman's guts. Not to mention the whole fanny bomb element of this, with Snake returning to Mother Base to find his comrades massacred, only for Miller to respond with, "They played us like a damn fiddle!" In previous installments in the series, not only would the heavier aspects of the game's narrative be slightly toned down, the rape scene in the audio tape in particular stands out quite spectacularly, but the melodrama and the humour would be woven into the main story in a way that, as previously stated, made everything slightly more light-hearted and even charming. There is certainly that humour to be found in Ground Zeroes, but is instead relegated almost entirely to the side missions as opposed to the main game. I understand that this is the point in the series where Big Boss is supposed to go bad, but it's such a severe tonal shift that it makes that whole aspect harder to swallow. However, even with all of these criticisms in mind, I can't help but enjoy Ground Zeroes, and I find myself more excited than ever for the Phantom Pain. It almost makes me ashamed to say that, given how grotesque some of the material presented in Ground Zeroes was, and the fact that Hideo is consistently proving that he has problems representing women, such as his decision to sexualise the character of Quiet in order to encourage cosplay. I'm sorry, but I just can't help but be excited, okay? The gameplay in Ground Zeroes was better than it ever has been in the series. And on a side note, it's odd to consider that the fact that a Metal Gear Solid game finally controls like an actual fucking video game is enough for me to say that the gameplay is fucking amazing. And even though that humour and melodrama that made me love the series is relegated to the sidelines in Ground Zeroes, there is something so delightfully dumb and perhaps even prescient about having to rescue Hideo Kojima himself from a world that he developed. The idea that the helicopter you use for extraction can play Flight of the Valkyries even when you're trying to make a quiet escape is kind of hilarious. The fact that the main antagonist and the one who, in the trailers for the Phantom Pain, conveys all of the pseudo-philosophical guff that I want from a Metal Gear Solid game is called Skullface because his face looks kind of like a skull gives me hope that Kojima's voice is still in there somewhere, and I'm willing to sit through however many hour-long bullshit-filled cutscenes Kojima is willing to subject me to in order to find it. It's things like this that exemplify why artistic vision and remaining steadfast in that vision are so important, in any medium really, but especially important to games, seeing as the medium is still developing. Without Kojima's voice, Ground Zeroes, even with its radically improved gameplay, would be considered, by me anyway, to be an astronomical failure. This is something people rarely experience in the world of games, and it makes the concept of Konami refusing to let go of the Metal Gear franchise, even though they have already let go of Kojima, even harder to grasp. Kojima is the heart of this series. Without him, you may have the most competently designed game of the series, but it won't matter in the slightest because there is no one who has an artistic voice quite like the man that originated it. We probably won't find out the exact details of what transpired between Kojima and Konami for quite some time. That said, one can probably make some reasonable assumptions as to the relationship between a multi-million-dollar company and a man that focuses solely on artistic vision with little or no concern for the bottom line. This arguably makes the case for Kojima's auteurship that much more conceivable, as not only is Kojima consistently battling with fans as to what they want, whilst also remaining true to his artistic vision, he also has to battle with the business element of game development. And in any art form, especially one as costly as game development, the struggle between business and art is ongoing, and often bloody. Side note, for a better analysis of this struggle than I could ever write, I implore you to read Alistair Gray's Lanark. It'll blow your fucking mind. As an artist myself, I believe that part of what makes great art is the struggle that goes into creating it. As Truffaut argues, even if an auteur creates a comparably insignificant work of art, the struggle of an auteur to make it is itself inherently interesting. This is why I believe that auteurism is incredibly important to games, and as the medium develops, we will begin to see more and more creators being described in this way. Recently I played a game entitled The Magic Circle, which plays upon a number of the things I have touched upon here. It is an interesting, if not wholly successful, exploration of meta-narrative, revolving entirely around the idea that the player is exploring an incomplete world, changing the attributes of the creatures within it in order to disrupt the vision of the person heading its creation, the reason the game is taking so long to complete to begin with. The way that many people have been talking about this game suggests that this is a chance for the player to finally wrestle some control away from the whiny developers that treat the player with such disrespect and distrust. I feel, however, that this is a reductive statement, as the ending of the game, and there are potential spoilers here, after leading the player along a set path of objectives that the player can tackle in whichever way they choose, the game closes by asking the player an important question. If you think you could do better, then why the hell don't you? The auteur, fatigued and almost relieved, hands control over to the players who believe they are the ones who know where the game should go, only for the creator to smugly watch as a disorganised crowd of inexperienced developers bring havoc and anarchy to his world. If ever there were a more concise case to be made for auteur theory in video games, this is it. Game development is, and I say this as an outsider, an absolutely gruelling process requiring a more complete understanding of how to merge technical knowledge with artistic vision than perhaps any other art form. I for one am of the belief, for example, that BioWare made the wrong choice by revising the ending to Mass Effect 3 and bowing to public demand. Firstly, it was a move that proved largely unsuccessful given that most discussion surrounding Mass Effect 3 to this day revolves around the fact that its ending remains disappointing to fans. Secondly, however, and perhaps more crucially, even if the original ending disappointed fans, it was the ending that BioWare put into the game. They made a conscious decision that that was going to be the case, no matter how much upset it caused. Ultimately, this is slightly different from the idea of a typical auteur, as the production team at BioWare is arguably somewhat more anonymous than the likes of Kojima, for example. Perhaps they are the metteur en scène that Truffaut mentions, not making poor games, but lacking real personality. But the key to true artistry, as has been discussed in other videos on this channel, is surprising people and taking them out of their comfort zones, even if it seems disappointing to them at first. Kojima himself has stated that he always wants to betray fans' expectations. Examine the language there. Betray. This is a combative word, which seems to suggest that Kojima has little regard for his fans. This is, I would argue, a great thing. I would say that this is precisely why people flock to Metal Gear Solid whenever a new one is announced. Regardless of whether or not you like Raiden as a character, you remember the feeling of having the rug pulled from under you when he is revealed to be the player character in Sons of Liberty. No matter how Kojima might fail in any project he undertakes, no matter how anachronistic some of his ideas regarding games and films seem, no matter how problematic some of his narrative and design choices are, his unique voice always shines through. I may not agree with everything Hideo Kojima says, but I can't help but love and even crave the conviction with which he says it. Keep on keeping on, you beautiful moron. I'm Hamish Black, and this has been Writing on Games. I'll see you next time.